Then the last thing that this panel requested, uniquely through the day, was that we have a poll for our audience. Our panelists want to get a little bit of a sense of who's on. We have almost 100 people. So I'm gonna put this poll as live. And so when you get a chance, fill in whether you identify most as an Arctic researcher, a policy or decision maker, or an Arctic resident. So we'll leave that open for a while, and hopefully that'll help the panelists know how to pitch their answers. So with that, over to you, Jari, to moderate this panel on diminishing ice cover in the Arctic.
Okay, thank you very much, Alan. So welcome. I don't know, could I say that good morning or afternoon or good evening? But anyway, welcome for this panel. The panel is focusing on diminishing ice cover in Arctic, both for sea ice and land ice. And we have 5 panelists. So they give the short introductions about the subject, and then we are starting about the discussion. And I hope that you from web, you send questions to us. So I just have prepared some of the questions, and so in order to have a really live discussion with you, I hope that you are using this question and answer possibilities during our discussion. So from Iceland, we have an Eydís Finnbogadóttir and Joaquin. They are both from the National Land Survey of Iceland. Eydís is the Director General of that institute, and Joaquin is a PhD in glacier and remote sensing, also working in that institute. Then from Sweden, we have Anders Turesson. He is a chair of AMAP, and he's officially working in the Swedish Environmental Agency. He has long experience on the climate policy issues. Then we have from China, Huigen. He is from Polar Research Institute of China, and he is vice chair of IASC. But I think we have not got him online yet.
He is just joining us now.
Great. Thank you very much, and welcome, Huigen. And then we have Hajo Eicken. Hajo Eicken is a director of IARC, International Arctic Research Center from Fairbanks, Alaska, University of Alaska. He's also very active on the setting up the Arctic Observing Summit, but he's also a sea ice scientist. He's an expert on sea ice. So let's start about the highest presentation, short introduction about the sea ice changes in the Arctic, and what do you want us to say? Please, Hajo.
Thanks, Jari. Thanks, everybody. If I could ask Alan to share the slide on my behalf. This is what you'll be seeing here in a minute. Is probably very familiar to a lot of you, but it's a slightly different twist. These are the sea ice concentration anomalies for last fall, the month of October 2019. You see the map there, large areas of much lower ice concentration, open water, all around the Arctic Ocean. At the top, you see how these ice concentrations and anomalies have evolved over the past several decades. This is data compiled by the National Snow and Ice Data Center here in the US. And what I wanted to highlight is, as we think about diminishing ice in the Arctic, is the fact that the variability and the long-term trends that we're seeing here in terms of creating larger areas of open water, diminished ice concentration, are occurring at timescales that in some ways are more rapid than what we're used to dealing with from a sustainability or governance perspective. You know, how do we respond at the local scale or at the national, international, global scale to these changes in the ice cover, and ensure that the various aspects of the ice cover that serve humanity, that provide important services, again, at the local, regional, and global level, are managed and maintained to the extent that we can manage and maintain those. And so I just wanted to highlight 3 aspects of that. One of them is quite obvious, and a lot of you are aware of this. You heard earlier today from a couple of panelists on this as well, and that is that all these coastal regions that used to be protected by sea ice for most or much of the year now are experiencing much longer open water seasons. So there's greater risk from the perspective of threats to coastal communities in terms of coastal erosion, waves, but there is also greater access. And one of the key conclusions in the context of sustainability that we found in looking at hazards in the ice-covered Arctic Ocean is that those areas that are most important from a human perspective with respect to access, from the perspective of marine ecosystems that provide important services, are also those areas that carry the greatest level of hazards and hence risks. That's a significant challenge from a sustainability perspective as well, and something we need to focus on a bit more. The other thing, again, talking about rapid changes, those of you who are familiar with the Bering Sea and the Pacific Arctic sector has undergone very big changes in the last few years, again, at a speed that a lot of the, for example, fisheries management bodies in the region are having trouble keeping up with. Marine ecosystem restructuring would be a way to summarize that. And finally, at the global scale, disruption of the important role the sea ice cover and other parts of the ice cover, whether snow on land or the ice sheets, play in the context of climate regulation. The disruption of these climate regulation services is something that is well understood from an observations perspective in terms of by how much are we seeing different types of ice decline, but is much less clear how do we respond to that as a global community in terms of ensuring that we respond in an effective manner. So I think that's where I'd like to leave it. Thank you, Jari.
Thank you very much for this introduction about that. Okay, so let's move on. So how about the Eydís? Did you prepare some slides also?
I got some slides. I will see if I can share them. Let me see. Do you see my slides now, or?
We do not see them yet, no.
No, okay. Sorry, share this one? What about now?
There we go. We can see your screen, but it's showing the whole screen and not just the presentation view.
Oh,
click now on
sorry, you did that? Do you, what about now?
There you go, all set.
Very good.
All set, okay, very good. So we will talk a little bit about actually some access to data and also give you an introduction of the land ice here in Iceland. But in 2014, the scientists officially declared the extent of a glacier called Og here in Iceland. And that glacier was only a small, one of many smaller glaciers that have vanished during the last decades here in due to a warmer climate. The Icelandic glaciers are closely monitored by a wide range of measurements that allow establishing their volume changes. It's based on a fieldwork and on a series of remote sensing data, such as aerial photos, old spy images even, and also modern satellite stereo images and LiDAR data. By using the combination of the existing data, we have found out, and the scientists in Iceland, in a yet published document by Aðalgeirsdóttir et al., they have figured out that since the Little Ice Age in Iceland in 1890, the Icelandic glaciers have lost their mass of about 4 gigatons annually. That is, the Icelandic glaciers are corresponding to the amounts of leveling, rising the sea levels of 1 centimeter if all of them would melt. the importance of glaciers here in Iceland are not only to be viewed by the tourists, like many of the tourists do enjoy the glaciers, but not less for the hydrology of the country, and the meltwater from the glaciers are harnessed for our hydropower plants that are producing the electricity for this country. I would like to put emphasis on the importance of access to data, because of free and open access, if that is set as a national policy, it will give us more than anyone can foresee what these data can be used for. I would take an example, and that's first, this slide that you see here is an example from Mýrdalsjökull in the South Iceland, where we have used several different methods of trying to estimate the volume changes in this glacier through the last tens of years. Sorry, the next slide, do we get it here? Okay. So I also want to talk to you about the access to data, and one example is the Arctic DM project that started as an announcement by the President Obama when the US was leading the Arctic Council in 2015 to 2017. This project, it led to a cooperation in Iceland and also with the Polar Geospatial Center in Minnesota. And it resulted with the first production of a new height model here in Iceland that is freely open, with a new method that was developed here in Iceland. This model, in cooperation or used together with old images and access to old images, has made us available has made them available methods of estimating the glaciers and the glacier changes here in Iceland. I put up this slide here for showing the increased accuracy of this Arctic DM data that has been developed within Iceland, and gives us a totally new perspective. And I'm sure that Obama did not notice that when he was releasing this data, that this would be the ground data for us to estimate the volume changes here in Iceland. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I've noticed there is no yet questions or answers, so let's continue on this short introduction. So about the Huigen, are you now online, and do you have a presentation ready?
Huigen, you should be okay to talk now.
Yes.
Okay, thank you. So I'd like to show, is it shared?
Yes.
So,
Once again, we can see the whole screen, not just the presentation. So if you go into presentation mode,
yeah.
it'll just be a little bit bigger.
Yeah.
Great, thanks.
Thank you. So with the diminishing ice cover, I think one important issue concerned by the country in Asia will be the Arctic sea roads. So far, China has practiced on using of the Arctic sea roads. So starting from 2012, our research vessel Shelong has tried the first transit from China to Iceland. Then starting from 2013, the Coast Yongsen has for the first commercial transit. And from 2016, the Yongsen Plus program started the 5 vessels conducting 6 voyages. And the coast in 2017, in Coastal Shipping was founded a specialized carriers. So till 2019, a total of 30 voyages, in which 28 transits and 3 destinations has been carried out. So Arctic Sea Roads function as a maritime shortcut connecting the major economic agglomeration between Northeast Asia and West Europe. Arctic transit shipping can save as 30 to 40% of greenhouse emissions compared to the traditional sea roads using light fuels. And the Arctic destinational shipping enables reliable and timely and economic distribution of Arctic energy to the world market. And in fact, the transportation of LNG produced in Yamal region to East Asia via Northern Sea Roads can save as much as 14 to 12 days. So for China has hopes to work with all parties to build a Polar Silk Road through developing Arctic shipping roads. It encourages its company to participate in infrastructure construction for those roads and conduct commercial voyages in accordance with law to pave the way for commercial and regularized operation. And it also actively conducted studies on these sea roads and continues to strengthen hydrographic surveys with aim to improving navigation, security, logistic capacity in the Arctic. China also abides by Polar Code and supports IMO in playing an active role. So China is aiming for stronger international cooperation in infrastructure cooperation on construction and operation of the Arctic Sea Roads. So that's my short presentation message to this discussion.
Thank you very much, Huigen, and very nice, little bit different viewpoint than the previous speakers. When we move on
Yes,
to Anders, maybe you have your presentation ready?
Yeah, I hope Alan can help me out with that one.
Okay.
I have a short presentation, only 3 slides. I wanted to start off by introducing the organization that I'm sharing, which is AMAP, Arctic Monitoring and Assessment Program. It is a working group under the Arctic Council, so I guess I am identified as the policymaker in a way in this panel. And as the name reveals, it monitors the Arctic environment, ecosystems, and human populations, and provides scientific advice to support governments. So we report actually to the 8 Arctic countries and also to the 6 permanent participants, which are organizing the indigenous populations in the Arctic as they tackle pollution and adverse effects of climate change. So please, Alan, next slide. We are conducting assessments and present them, of course, in reports. Here we have a sample of reports from the last 4 years. All reports have a summary for policymakers and also recommendations to the policymakers. And next slide, please, Alan. I guess for this seminar, the most relevant report is the one we call SWEPA, Snow, Water, Ice and Permafrost in the Arctic, which was released in 2017. it was updated. We published an update a year ago, and it contained two conclusions that I persistently repeat in every presentation almost that I'm doing. And the first one is that annual average Arctic temperature actually rose by 2.7 degrees centigrade from 1973 to 2017. Of course, that is a quite dramatic figure, and it has resulted in a changing environment in the Arctic that has just begun, and which is extremely important to continue to follow, to monitor closely. And perhaps one of the most dramatic results is that the volume of the Arctic sea ice in the month of September, which is the minimum sea ice volume, has declined by 75% since 1979. So that finalizes my short introductory presentation. Thank you very much for that.
Thank you very much, Anders. Now I'm happy to see that there are a couple of questions, from audience. I think two questions, and let's move on those questions. So the first question was for Huigen, and there was some kind of concern that about the shipping in the Arctic, and in particular that the person was questioning about why we scientists should support about the enhanced navigation in Arctic. So about that for China, why, this is a maybe difficult question, but what do you say? What is the motivation for scientific motivation for you to do any kind of research supporting the Arctic navigation?
I think you're muted.
Sorry.
Again.
Yeah. There you go.
Did you have?
Yeah. Now does it? Yeah. So ecological or environmentally, the diminishing of Arctic sea ice. It's a more of a disaster, or so we are suffer from the environment consequences. But in the other hand, as a human being, we should positively act or adapt to the environment change. So, as a scientist, I think to make a good use of of environment change is important. It's also an important part of research.
All right. Maybe I can also
indeed the northern serial, it can, by using of the northern, it's a shortcut, and it can save the carbon carbon emissions.
Yeah. Maybe I can leave it, say something from my side, because this is also my own research subject, and because this is something that of course mankind has always think about the ice is obstacle. Mankind has always had a dream, you going from the west to east through the Arctic Ocean. There has been attempts for hundreds of years, that one. Now when the climate is warming and the sea ice is retreating during the summertime, then of course it's very natural that there are commercial activities in Arctic, and the attempts to using the Northern Sea route as a trading passage. This is something that the scientists cannot really decide. It's political questions, and I think many of the politics nationals are really favoring of that one. Of course, one can think it's environmentally, it is not so good thing. The risk for the navigation, in particular the trading oil and gas in these harsh Arctic areas, are very, very risky. And that's the reason why the scientists should also do some research there in order to minimize all the risks, to the ice risks, and so on. So I think that we need to also do some research, or even quite much research, to support the safe navigation in Arctic.
Absolutely. So scientists involved in such kind of research, not only economic way, but also, of course, environment and scientific research is needed. It's a big issue.
How about the other panelists? Would you like to comment about that issue?
Maybe I could say something. I concur with what you're saying, and if the possibility to use the iceless Arctic for transportation of goods, if that opens up, it will be very difficult to stop it, given the political situation that we have right now, and given the strong economic interests that are there. What we need to do is really to ensure that this doesn't have an environmental cost that is unsustainable. And I also believe that an important area for research for scientists is actually the economic and political impacts as such, and the effects it has on the people living in the Arctic, of course, but moreover the ecosystem as a whole. So I think this is an extremely important subject to look into, and I believe that the scientific community has to play an important role here.
Okay, thanks, Anders. Then there was another question about the climate variability. This was something, noting that always in the Arctic there has been a cold spells, warm spells, and so on. So the natural variability is always very, very strong in the Arctic. And in particular, this year is very interesting because many of the people which are living in Europe have experienced extremely warm winter. In fact, we have had only the autumn and spring, not winter at all. In particular, for example, ice conditions in the Baltic. We have measured the ice extent since the 1720, and this year has been absolutely minimum. Never has been so little ice in the Baltic as in this year. On the contrary, in Arctic, this year the wintertime ice extent is larger than an average. Not larger than an average, but larger than during the last 8 or 6 years, 7 years. So I think that we have to go back in 2012 when the winter ice extent was larger than an average. So that was a really question about what are the reasons for that one. And maybe Hajo, maybe you can explain a little bit about this climate variability and long-term trends in Arctic.
Yeah, thanks, Jari. I think that's a very interesting question, because the thing to recognize is that summer sea ice has been declining substantially over the last 4 decades. We've lost much of the sea ice in the central Arctic that survives the summer, but at the same time, in particular, in the past few years, we've seen significant declines in winter sea ice as well. In particular, by losing much of the winter sea ice in the Bering Sea and the Pacific Arctic sector. But what's important to recognize is, as Jari pointed out, is that in the Arctic, there's a few important atmospheric circulation patterns that drive and contribute to interannual variability, regardless of what the long-term climate trends are doing. So they're sitting on top of you've got the long decline, and on top of that, you have this interannual variability. And this past winter has been interesting because one of these circulation patterns, the so-called Beaufort High, a large scale high pressure system that typically sits over the Western Arctic, was not present. And as a result, the clockwise circulation that dominates ice movement in the North American and Western Arctic sector was absent, and much of that ice just sat more or less in place. That can have important impacts at the local scale from the perspective of ecosystems, maritime shipping, how coastal community can access resources associated with the ice cover. And it's this type of variability that is actually likely to increase further in future years because the lack of thick multi-year ice results in the Arctic sea ice cover being more mobile overall, but also enhancing some of the interactions between the atmosphere, the ice cover, and the underlying ocean. So from the perspective of some of the questions that have come up earlier, safe navigation, minimizing harm to the environment, access to marine resources, a lot of the livelihoods of coastal communities that depend on marine ecosystems, we have to be aware that we will see more extreme swings from one year to the other in those parts of the Arctic that are dominated by sea ice, and finding better ways to predict these types of variations on longer timescales, on timescales of not just a few weeks or less than a week, but several months out on the seasonal scale, or maybe even interannual scale, is an area of important research and potential concern.
All right. There has to be a couple of additional questions related on that one. First is about that you have been now talking very much on the ice extent. How about the ice thickness? You already said something a little bit about the muddy ice, but how the ice thickness has been changed. And then about this multi-year variability. Is there any kind of predictability about this mode? I mean, the models, atmospheric models, predict about is there coming a cold season or cold next 5 years will be colder than an average? How models are capable for such kind of prediction?
Well, I'm not a modeler. I mean, from the observation side, yes. The ice cover, the Arctic sea ice cover on the ocean has been getting substantially thinner and has lost almost half of its volume in the last couple of decades. So those observations are clear. We have very good satellite-based and surface-based measurements of ice thickness. The impact of that in general is that we see greater interannual variability in the Arctic as a result of this, because the smaller the ice volume, the smaller the area that is covered by sea ice in the summertime, the greater interannual swings you see in terms of ice extent. So I think that's the key point to highlight. But I'm not sure whether this thickness was only question about thickness was only referring to sea ice, or maybe it might be interesting to also hear more about thinning of glaciers and ice sheets. So that's something that maybe Eydís can comment on as well.
Yes, that's the studies from here in Iceland, and I think I will hand it over to Joaquin to answer that.
I think I completely agree with what you were mentioning about the trends in climate in the affecting the sea ice, it represents also very well the changes in land ice, and we can see that in Iceland also the annual and interannual variability of mass balance of glaciers, how it has been also following the same patterns that you are describing in the sea ice. So I completely agree with these patterns. I think, for example, we have seen in the last summer, we saw very strong melting of glaciers, but in the previous 3 or 4 years, it was a bit less negative. And in the previous years, it has been also significantly negative. So these small time scales cannot be misinterpreted, and we need to look at the full range of time scales. And overall, we can say that in the last 2 decades, there has been a very significant mass loss of the land ice. And this is, of course, connected to the temperature. And we can see this trend in Iceland, and it also matches very well with the trends that have been observed for Greenland and for Norway. So it seems, at least for this sub-region of the Arctic, they all are showing the same trend. I'm not so familiar with other parts of the Arctic, but I think it's the same.
Sorry, Jari, you're muted right now. We can't hear you.
So you said that there are consistent trends in the sea ice decreasing the sea ice and glaciers all around of the Arctic. I guess it's concerned for the permafrost too, and also the snow cover. So there's no question about the changing in the Arctic cryosphere. But then they're interesting about because usually this kind of hemispheric averages, they show strong trends. Locally, it could be shown even stronger. So do you have good examples how locally you have seen about the changes? Have you already done some adaptation? Do you need to consider about adaptation because of the changes of glaciers, changes of the ice cover, and so changes on ecosystem? Could you say something about some examples from your side? Who would like to start? Eydís, yes.
I mean, the minimizing of the glaciers here means also more melt water, which means that there are more water in the reservoirs at the moment for the power plants. So we can see that it's changing. We can also see, of course, the extent of the glaciers here are changing. That is affecting as well the lagoons in front of the lakes. That is affecting then the roads, road systems and so on here in Iceland. So that's effects that are directly to us, and of course economically as well. I don't know if you were asking about that or.
Yeah, yes, like that one. But also that I think if you're going a little bit to different areas in Arctic, like in Svalbard, the marine biologist has noticed about changes of fisheries. How about that? Do you see Iceland is a country which has always been, living on fish? Have you seen changes in your ecosystem, marine ecosystem already?
Absolutely, there are changing in the species around Iceland. There are new species coming in. The mackerel is of course the new big species that has come into this area, and then we also see that in the bird life. Some of the birds that used to be here have moved further up north, and there are less of them here. So we can also see that something is happening in the ocean. We also can see that the extent or the amount of glaciers here or glacier ice here is holding hand a little bit to the sea temperature. So as the temperature in the sea rises, it affects the climate here in Iceland, which means that it's affecting as well the glaciers. So we are in everything of these climate changes that is and warmer climates is affecting us. It's also affecting us by the weather. There are more storms here and more powerful storms. We have had quite harsh winter now, like you mentioned earlier, that up north it has been maybe more winter and less winter down in southern part of the northern hemisphere. More snow, and that is definitely affecting us economically by have to clean up more snow, for example. So it's the wildlife, it's the fishery, it's everywhere where we can see this affecting us differently.
Okay, thank you very much, Iceland. How about some news from Alaska? You already mentioned or indicated in your slide that there has been some observed evidences about the ecosystem changes in Alaska. Could you a little bit more specify? And in particular, is there any kind of adaptation strategies for those changes, and how do you think about the changes are continuing in future?
Thanks, Jari. Yes, I had already mentioned in the last few years, the Bering Sea has seen anomalously warm waters, parts of the year several degrees above normal in the surface waters, with major impacts on a range of marine wildlife. I'm not a marine biologist, so I only know more about this from my colleagues in marine biology, and in particular from talking to residents in a lot of the communities in the region. And I notice here actually Sean Topcock who's from Western Alaska region asked the question in that context that I'm trying to also cover a bit here in my response. So Sean's question was, what can you do in terms of both showing and mitigating impacts and rapid changes that affect the subsistence way of life of indigenous peoples, both in the Alaskan, Arctic, and elsewhere. And that's where I see a lot of these things being connected. Many of the reports of details of how these changes in the Bering Sea, for example, have been playing out over the past couple of years have come from coastal communities, from indigenous experts who are observing changes in the environment, not just from the perspective, say, ocean temperature, but also impacts on how are different species of fish moving? What is the health of some of the marine mammals that they depend on? And it's those changes in the Pacific Arctic sector that have been quite pronounced and dramatic over the last couple of years. What you're finding is that some of the changes are so rapid that the government agencies and researchers who are doing, conducting long-term surveys, for example, of fish stocks, have had to scramble to adapt where they're actually taking samples to keep up with these northward shifts of some of the species of importance. And that does relate to another point that might be relevant for this panel here as well, from the sustainability perspective, from the perspective of responding to these changes effectively. I would point to examples, for example, in Greenland, where the Pasuna Net, a community-based observing network that's also focused on managing living marine resources associated with the Greenland Hunters and Fishermen's Association, has been very effective in combining observations of changes in fish stocks, such as, Eydís mentioned changes in distribution of mackerel, combining observations of changes in fish stocks with direct recommendations as to how to adjust management and quota for some of these species based on community insights and community, both local and indigenous expertise. That's an important area where I see the research community is sometimes not even being fast enough in responding to some of these findings, where a stronger collaboration with experts at the local level is absolutely critical.
All right. And this is something that maybe for our next thing, you know, we have like a satellite which are provided the large scale information on the sea ice extent or glaciers. But what do you think about is our observation capabilities enough good to really capture about the local changes? What do you higher say? Just that the local people sometimes know better than the scientists. And do you think that there is some lack between the local and the Pan-Arctic measurements, and how we can enhance such kind of measurements? Maybe Hajo, you can start because you are now on screen.
Yeah, sorry, I'll keep it brief. I don't want to take up too much time with the panel. What I see as a great opportunity, and it might be nice to hear from Anders Turesson about this a bit more as well, is that these international collaborations, in particular the Sustaining Arctic Observing Networks, or SEAN initiative, that has strong participation from Arctic and non-Arctic countries, including China and other Asian countries, those are now starting to become more effective in creating a framework of how you can combine these local scale observations with large scale, say, satellite observing programs or other large scale efforts. And I would just like to highlight, you know, as part of the Arctic Science Summit Week, starting on Monday next week, we'll have the Arctic Observing Summit, where we're trying to bring together indigenous experts. There's a working group on indigenous food security that's part of the Arctic Observing Summit, as well as people associated with, say, global observing programs, to identify how do we best collaborate, create joint frameworks within which observations at the community level have the same visibility, relevance, and utility as the observations, say, at the satellite scale or the global scale. There's a lot of work to be done on that, but I feel very optimistic that, in particular, over the last couple of years, there's been a lot of progress made, and there's now ways in which people can collaborate in that setting. And you know, these types of meetings where you have online interactions are one way in which you can foster that. Thanks.
Maybe I should just add on there, because I think you're absolutely right, Hajo. Integrating the local perspective, the traditional knowledge, and the people living in the Arctic in general is, of course, a major goal, and also sometimes a challenge for the Arctic Council as in general, but not least for AMAP. We are really trying to find ways to integrate the indigenous people's knowledge into the assessments of AMAP. And of course, that must start from the very beginning, which is when let's say, the problem itself is somehow identified and formulated. What are the research going to target? What kind of issues, what kind of problems should be the object of the research? And in this process, I believe that those who are, let's say, the closest stakeholders here, namely those who are living in the Arctic, are very important. And I think that, you know, the importance of this perspective of the people living in the Arctic is becoming more and more apparent to the scientists and the scientific community as a whole, in the way that you are describing, Hajo. That is correct. I have a feeling that the view on this is actually somehow changing now, because the value and it also has to be translated. Scientists and the people living in the Arctic are sometimes speaking different languages, and they don't really meet in an easy way. So somehow they need to be able or develop their ability to communicate with each other. And I think that is happening as well. And that can only, of course, be enhanced by the inclusion of the local perspectives and the indigenous people's perspectives in this. So this is an extremely important area which we are struggling with.
All right, thank you very much. I would like a little bit continue this topic discussion and ask from Huigen about this Northern Sea route, because you are active in there. When there are ships operating in a Northern Sea route, then of course the ships could do a lot of measurements. There are good examples in other regions in ocean that the ships are doing measurements for scientists, but also they're improving their safety. But Russia is very, very restricted about any measurements in their EEZ. How about your China? You have active collaboration with in that area. Do you have managed to build a trust with the Russians, and when you are operating in the Russian EEZ or your ships are operating there, could you install instruments on the vessels, and could you conduct the measurements in the Russian EEZ?
Thank you for in the practice during our voyage on Northern Sea route, no observation is allowed during that. But for the northwest passage crossing, so we have developed the collaboration with Canadian colleagues. So we were able to conduct some investigation into the passage. And on the sea road, so for the Shelongs, but for our commercial ship, of course, they do not have much. They're just doing the measurement for just for navigation. But Shelong has done also tried the what we call the Central Sea Road. So on the way we have conducted investigation around the Central Sea Road, and we have also developed what we call ice stations. So far we have deployed several ice stations in the Central Arctic, and it is drifting with. Maybe I can show you a little bit.
You want to share something?
Yes, I can show you a little bit. Yeah.
I think we little bit have a time problem.
Okay, so that's
Yeah.
okay.
Yeah.
So that's what we have done. Yeah. So we are not only so we are also conduct the observation, especially on the Central Sea Road. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much. But that was I was also thinking like that. We still have we don't have much time yet anymore. So only 5 minutes time, and one of the last discussion item was about how the scientist could serve better for the society. Traditional scientists has make an assessment like a AMAP assessment or the SWIPA assessment or IPCC assessment. We don't, Anders is probably the only person which is really not doing the science yourself, but you are using the scientific results. And of course, the scientists would always want as productive and also as beneficial for society as possible. Do you think that we should have a more interaction between the scientists and the governmental institutes, policymakers, and how we can improve? I mean that maybe some scientists on IASC itself could have some orders. What kind of things need to be conducted? Or do you think that the Arctic Council itself already is enough strong and powerful to guidance or the asking about the support from the science community?
Well, I think at least Arctic Council is one important platform for communication between scientists and politicians. It is a structure there. There are working groups, etc. So that is important. I would like, though, to underline that, in my view, the scientific community is doing what it should be doing in the Arctic at the moment. And in fact, we shouldn't, and this is definitely my view, that the whole process going on, the whole political process on climate change, because we shouldn't forget that this is a global issue. We see the effects particularly fast and dramatic in the Arctic environment, but it is caused on a global level. So we need to involve the world community, and there is a political process, as you know. But I would, in a way, say that this is a scientific-driven process. It started off with the formation of the IPCC in 1988, in fact. One could, of course, wish that things were going faster, and you know, that the impact of science on politics could be larger. But of course, politics is a complicated thing, but we know that things need to happen very rapidly now in order to stop the rapidly changing climate globally, in particular in the Arctic. I think the science in the Arctic and about the Arctic has a particularly important role in showing and using the Arctic in a way as a thermometer. I guess that if you should put a thermometer on the globe somewhere, it should be in the Arctic, because there things happen much faster than elsewhere, and also and this is important to underline, this is according to the models. It was noted already in the first assessment report of the IPCC that this is the kind of development that we could expect. And to have this confirmed by the scientists is extremely important. But there is another field that is also extremely important in the Arctic, and that is the adaptation issue. How can we deal with the climate change that is ongoing? How will the communities of the Arctic be able to change their pattern of living, their subsistence, etc.? That is an extremely important issue, which has important ethical connotations as well.
All right, thank you very much, Anders. So this is just a really good concluding remarks from you. How about the other panelists? We are already running out of time, but if you have a very, very quick concluding remarks, you are welcome to say so.
Can I go in now? So I think that one of the main tasks now is actually to share data, and that the scientists will have access to each other information, as well as the methods used. And we have seen that here by using the data released from US in the Arctic DM, for example, by using that and having the access to the data, having the access to ASSW data, having access to information and methods from others, that will speed up the process. And that will also give us better information and less of our estimations and more facts. And I think we should also try to talk a little bit more clear. And when we are talking with the locals and talking about results and so on, I think we should maybe be a little bit more little Greta and just be like a 16-year-old and say what is need to be said, and a little bit less complicated when we are trying to tell people out there the results and so on in the science. So definitely the scientific work in here is the very, very much important one.
Right, thank you very much. How about the Huigen? Would you like to say something?
Yes, I think scientific research should do science itself, but also we should pay attention to the use of the Arctic and the mitigation and the adaptation. So all of those, which scientists should also pay attention on those aspects as well.
All right, thank you very much. And then the final words from Alaska. Hajo, please.
Thanks, Jari. I'd like to build on what Eydís outlined. I think in addition to sharing data, we have to share our understanding of what is important about the Arctic. What are the important problems that need to be solved that require collaboration? So involving indigenous peoples, the Arctic residents early on, and having them clearly tell us and define the problem that needs to be solved using scientific approaches is important, and finding ways to more effectively engage policymakers and other decision makers in that process as well. That's the big challenge. We're making progress on that, but more needs to and can be done. Thanks.
All right, thank you very much, Hajo. And I think now we have to finish because we are run out of time, but it was so great. It was really great to discuss with you, learn about the new things, and hope also that you in the audience, you managed to follow about this discussion. There's a couple of questions which we didn't manage to handle, so I think we are writing about the responses for that one. But the things what we discussed here was the sharing the data, open data about policy and so on. That will continue this kind of discussion also for the Arctic Observing Summit in next week. Is it Tuesday, Monday, and Wednesday? So please join about those sessions too. Thank you very much, and bye-bye.